Today, I'm very happy to welcome Alexa White. Alexa is the co-founder of Aya Research Institute. She's also a Harvard Climate Justice Design Fellow, where she is engineering environmental justice screening and mapping tools for state and local governments in the Mid-Atlantic United States. She's also a Policy Entrepreneurship Fellow at Federation of American Scientists, where she works with the White House Council for Environmental Quality on environmental justice and sustainable development issues surrounding justice. Welcome, leaders. In a world constantly evolving, true leadership requires resilience, presence, vision, and a willingness to embrace challenge and change. I'm Dr. Stephen Sideroff, and this is Quantum Leadership Podcast, where we go beyond conventional leadership to explore the principles that connect mind, body, and organizational success. Alexa, such a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I'd love to start by you sharing a little bit of your path toward leadership. At what point you felt like this is a path for you to be a leader? What were some of your obstacles and a little bit of things that you had to deal with and how you overcame them in that process?
Of course. I would say that my origin story in terms of a leader began in high school. I was a very shy individual. I didn't really like to speak out a lot, and I didn't really have a lot of an opinion. I was very passive until my father actually forced me into be a debater, where I learned how to create an argument and won national championships, which gave me a lot of energy as well as kind of just validity in what I had to say. And a lot of my colleagues went on to law, but I decided to go down the field of science. And so I went to Howard University and studied biology and chemistry, through which I thought I was going to become a dermatologist. But there was one summer where I was investigating how to actually pay for school. And so in order to support my way through school, I needed to find some sort of funding. And this program was willing to pay for it if I was going to be willing to do research in the deserts of Arizona catching lizards, which is always fun. I thought I wanted to be the crocodile hunter. I went on to get my master's and PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology, thinking that lizards was going to be the path for me. And I quickly realized through other social interactions, through other extracurriculars that I was doing in the international space, specifically around climate, that people didn't really care about lizards as much as they cared about their well-being and climate change and being able to see the connections between science and policy was where I found my niche in terms of leadership. A lot of translation between these kinds of disciplines was lacking. I also had a lot of experience with changes in my how I saw myself identifying on the world stage as an African American woman in these international spaces. I felt as though I had a unique opportunity to be a really good communicator, to translate in between scientific and international spaces, as well as being able to speak from a point of identity that isn't usually seen on an international world stage.
So I appreciate how you saw yourself as someone who can integrate different fields and add to the conversation by doing that.
Really found academia to be quite isolating and doing, obviously you've done a PhD. It's a very individual experience. And in those individual experiences, I think that I gained the confidence to, one, understand that I was a producer of knowledge, and two, to not just understand that within the context of, writing papers and producing science, but that it's very useful in other spaces that it just doesn't normally reach.
So you switched into an area involving environment, climate issues. So it seems to me that you had a vision of how you wanted to have an impact. And that, in a sense, pulled you into the field you're in and pulled you into a position of leadership. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. And so through those international spaces and through the understanding that there needs to be this kind of conduit for a communication between science and international climate issues, I co-founded the Aya Research Institute. And so the Aya Research Institute was born from myself and a colleague of mine from undergrad, Adria Peterkin, um, in light of environmental injustices that we were seeing throughout both of our disciplines. And so the Aya Research Institute is meant to be a place where those communications become more common. It's a think tank, increasing the amount of scientists and engineers involved in international climate relations, as well as increasing the number of people of color and those kinds of minorities being involved in these spaces. And so a significant amount of our work is centered around better understanding how smaller projects, so for example, a project that I was leading in Jamaica, has relevance to larger international frameworks. So for example, the Sustainable Development Goals underneath the United Nations, which are usually really large, kind of hard to grasp ideas for people who aren't always in those spaces. And so by making it more apparent, by making it an easier kind of link, we allowed for or other organizations and academic institutions to get more grants, to better understand how they can influence policy, to better understand and be good at figuring out unique projects that are relevant to current political and climate issues.
So a lot of times we get stuck in our achieving our goals, in the path toward our goals, because something seems just so big. So like, where do we begin? So what I'm hearing you say is you found a small subset, you found a smaller environment that was more manageable to engage in to get results. And then from that, demonstrating the viability of an approach, you can then both expand it to other areas, but you also demonstrate to others what is possible. Can you say a little bit more about that approach to leadership?
Absolutely. When I first began doing international work, there were many naysayers. Oftentimes, the scale of international work is seen as daunting, and a lot of the work that is done within this niche of science and policy at this time isn't really as highlighted and kind of given the power and the importance that it could have and should have in the future. Yeah, could you repeat the question?
I was reflecting back on you choosing to go into Jamaica to work there on how to address certain issues rather than this whole global kind of issue and problem. And by doing that, you made it more manageable, greater opportunity for success. And then from there, you become a model for how other people can do it in other places.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Okay, I understand the question. Sorry. In Jamaica, that project was seen as the best model, one, because a lot of our constituents are from the United States and they speak American English and would be able to better understand the happenings of Jamaica, two, the proximity to the United States. And a lot of that work had to do with better understanding their agricultural ecosystems. And so understanding how they can feed themselves in terms of relying less on imports, relying less on needing to sell a lot of their products and having specialty crops. And so a lot of those issues, although on the face would be seen as something that's not really related. So, for example, someone from New York might not necessarily see the connection between how someone in Kingston, Jamaica relates to food. It created those connections in a very intimate way, in a way that everyone was able to kind of easily see that in their day-to-day lives, they have the same experiences.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit about the achievement in that project of what you were able to accomplish?
Yeah, so we were able to work with their agricultural ministry and figure out better standards for how they would approach relating with farmers. And so this is a qualitative and quantitative study understanding what farmers in the Jamaican Blue Mountains, how they can, one, better their infrastructure for being able to get their food and crops from the mountains and down to the city and vice versa, as well as integrating farmer perspectives into the actual legislation that's produced by the Jamaican government. And so oftentimes there are silos where governments are only talking to NGOs, academics are only talking to the government, and farmers generally are not included in that equation. And that study led to the integration of much more farmer narrative as well as farmers' weight in those conversations in determining what would indicators of good agriculture, indicators of agroecological practices, indicators of generally food sovereignty and security. And so the end of that project, we saw an increase in the number of farmers that were willing to participate in these studies and willing to give comment to a lot of these pieces of legislation in Jamaica.
So another highlight of what you're sharing with us is being able to put yourself into other people's shoes, like the farmer, to shift perspective for greater understanding of the problem, but also by shifting perspective, you also are more inclusive in the process.
Absolutely. The perspective was specifically around definitions of sustainable agriculture. And so, one, getting data to understand what farmers think sustainable agriculture is. And that's very different from what a government official or an NGO, field tech, or an academic professor would think sustainable agriculture is. And so, through one, gaining their perspective, which was unprecedented, and two, comparing that to the rest of the perspectives among the other groups, we were able to figure out what bridges are necessary, as well as create a pathway for communication in the long term.
What were the biggest obstacles you had to deal with in trying to get this integration or the different entities to see the other perspective?
Trust. Absolutely. Trust was definitely there. In qualitative work, in ethnography, there is often a sense of science being extractive. They'd been used to seeing researchers come into their communities and not necessarily have any sort of benefit to give them as a result of these conversations. And so there were a few times in the pilot where they voiced that. They were just like, why should we trust you? Why should we, participate? And I think that that's a really important flaw in the scientific process, at least in my experience, is that value of creating trust needs to be there from the beginning.
It's very well said. And it also points out to me that anytime you're entering a system, you need to deal with the immune system of that system. They've got their ways of thinking and doing and biases that somehow that's an obstacle. It's sort of like a barrier for integration. How did you get their trust? How did you break through that issue?
Spending time. And so a lot of the work that we did was over the course of 4 months, where we lived within the community, were able to have, casual downtime with the farmers, and being able to, have a very casual experience where we were befriending them, explaining different personal aspects of our lives. I went with another member of my lab, and she was Jamaican, and so it made it a lot easier to kind of translate specific parts of American life into Jamaican life through our personal experiences. And after we gained kind of a better understanding through the vulnerabilities of our personal lives, we were able to gain their trust and better their understanding and what was the outcome of this project, unlike I think other folks had done before.
Yeah, you're highlighting something that is important and perhaps we're at a place where we're more and more recognizing the importance of relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And here you're talking about how there was the development of relationship that helped shift their perspective and have greater trust in you. Can you say a little bit more about either the obstacles that you encountered with them, perhaps being skeptical, how you used relationship or engaged in relationship to get beyond that?
Yeah. So there were definitely times where trust was never built. So for example, there were people that just didn't want to participate or wanted to voice their opinion on what I was doing, and I allowed for that. There is no way to create trust without allowing for expression, and there is also a level of autonomy that everyone has. You can't force people to participate. And so after experiencing that a few times, I think that it became easier for me to kind of let go of some anxieties around feeling the need to kind of push people into things that they didn't want to do, as well as to better understand the cultural implications and the historical context that I was working within to better those relationships. And so moving forward, there was definitely a disconnect between specifically farmers and the government. And so, as well as understanding the farmers, I also had to understand the government. And so that ministry had been established only a few years prior. They were trying to figure out organizational issues and better their extension services. And so, through the kinds of obstacles that I would encounter with the farmers, I was able to better kind of have offerings for the government services that we were working with as well.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'd like to highlight here in this conversation. When I heard you say it didn't always go smoothly, and what you had to do was realize not to push. And when I think about that, I think about sometimes we have in our own heads the way we think it should be, and we try to not force, but try and coerce the other side to recognize what we think is the right way. And so I can appreciate where you were at in that conversation, which was they're not there. I'm not going to push them. And you sort of created what I would refer to as psychological space.
Hmm.
And when I say psychological space, it's giving the other person space to come to a new conclusion, but on their own time frame. Because as you try and push them there, usually you get a lot more resistance. And so the way you did it with being in a place of acceptance, not that you necessarily like something, but this is the reality here. They're not quite there yet. Let me take a pause. Let me give them some breathing space. Is that a fair assessment of the process you engaged in?
Absolutely. You want someone to want to participate. You don't want to push them because then the product is not going to be what you wanted because they were forced into it. So it'll alter their response. And then two, the feedback that's negative is also very valuable. Negative feedback is important for revising your methods. It's important for better understanding the context that you're working within. And so I was very open to hearing any sort of negative response as much as I was open to anyone that wanted to participate. I think that I think that that's generally true. You want someone to want to come along. You don't want to force someone.
Right, right. And what you're also doing in that process is creating a safe environment where they could be where they're at and it's okay rather than them feeling someone's trying to control them or manipulate them. And that helps in the establishment of trust as you were mentioning. And you're talking about negative feedback. And, this is an interesting term, negative feedback, because in any process that's new, where you're going into new territory, we don't know the answers. No one knows the answers if it's new territory, right? And so the more you can accept feedback, I would say, even without labeling it as positive or negative, it's feedback. I think it's helpful to stay in that neutral state because we're more capable of not reacting, more capable of being in this calm state where we're more able to be cognitively sharp to hear the message without putting our judgments onto it. So what you said, I would so totally agree with that. We want to be willing to hear any kind of feedback, not make judgments about it, because any feedback in this behavior response loop gives us new information from which to do a better response the next time.
Absolutely. And with that comes the ability to adapt. And so I would say that the problems that we were trying to remedy were a product of that. Were a product of kind of these forced relationships where there isn't a dynamic interaction between all of these different groups. It's kind of just a unilateral decision made and the legislation is pushed through and there's a lot of anger and resentment that's produced as a result of that. And so by way of the methodology that I was practicing in this research, it was also implemented through the products as well to better integrate the systems to be more interconnected.
You said anger and resentment. Could you say a little bit more about how that came out and how you dealt with it? Because I think anytime you're trying to create change, there's the potential for that.
Yes. And so one of the specialty crops that I was working with and have worked with throughout my scientific career is coffee. And coffee is a very unique crop in that normally it's just exported. Normally, in the countries that it's produced, it's not something that the citizens consume. And that's very true for Jamaica. And in that, there's a process by which coffee is grown, and then it is kind of taken through to the roasted bean that you see in your coffee cup. And so the farmers that I was speaking to, they only had jurisdiction over the growing process. In Jamaica, there is a regulatory body that prevents small farmers from being able to sell that to direct consumers. And so there's only a very small handful of farmers or processors that are allowed to ship outside for Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee. And so the anger and resentment that I was speaking of was from those farmers in that there's a lot of heavy regulation for what equipment they can have, for who they can sell to, for what beans are considered valuable versus not valuable. And those regulations over time, over the few years that that institution existed, created a lot of anger because they weren't able to make money on their terms. The price of coffee beans was not determined by them. It was determined by the processors, and there's only a handful of them. Resentment via not being able to acquire any of the materials to allow them to have any sort of upward mobility. My way of dealing with that was to create this line of communication, was to create some sort of integration of farmer narrative in the process, because the configuration, small scale farmers, was not really healthy for their livelihood. So the less that they would get for these coffee beans, the less they'd be able to put food on their table, the less they'd be able to send their children off to secondary institutions. And so this was really trying to alleviate those pressures, and the anger and resentment really came from just a lack of being able to communicate and a lack of feeling as though they had power.
And so that brings me to a related question here, because you have the government on one side, you have the farmers on the other side. They have different perspectives. How did you, as a leader, how did you navigate those conflicting goals or needs in terms of our conversation right now?
I would say in Jamaica, the primary skill that got honed as a leader was my mediation skills. Being able to exist in a room in the neutral state that we spoke about earlier and understand that there would be feedback, there would be dialogue, that they, as in farmers and these government institutions, would not necessarily be able to easily come to a conclusion or easily come to a place of agreement. But me in my neutral state being able to pick apart what each of them were saying to find those connections and make it much easier for them to communicate. And so I would say the two skills necessary for that project were mediation as well as very, very, very keen communication skills.
Are these skills that you were aware that you had going in? If you had to hone those skills under fire, so to speak, how did you do that?
I think I opened by talking about my experience debating. So I knew that I had the communication skills to speak to these different groups in a very efficient and effective way. It was more so these moments of conflict where there's emotions involved, there's livelihoods involved. Like we're speaking about people's lives and generations of families that have been involved in this industry for more than 100 years. And so I would say that communication was something that I was aware of. I just wasn't really I didn't understand how to use that in terms of mediation, and I quickly had to learn and did successfully.
Can you give us like an anecdote, a situation in which what we're talking about played itself out?
Yeah, absolutely. So every interval, I would say every month, we had to sit down with the council for in these agricultural ministries in Jamaica and kind of regroup and assess the data. And
This is the government side?
the government side.
Okay.
And moving forward, I realized that I didn't really want to be the only voice, the only conduit of that. I wanted other farmers to be involved in these conversations to better explain their positions. And I came across many farmers who were looking forward to that moment to articulate themselves and kind of have that platform. And so the first time that I did this, there was a woman who had an agroecological farm, and she was also a movement leader for organic coffee. And we were having this forum, and there was a moment where the government official kind of dismissed what she had to say, and there was obvious anger and kind of like, this is what always happens, this is why the issues exist. And we took a break, and as we came to step back in, I had to mediate in allowing this government official to understand that one, this is a new environment, to be much more open to kind of this process than they were the last time we were in the room, and also that these are really important to farmers' lives. Like, this is not kind of just some abstract report that you're putting out and kind of like a faceless thing. This person is here to kind of offer not just data, but offer very personal, intimate, vulnerable pieces of themselves in order to try to convince you that they can change some sort of piece of legislation. And it also made me realize that this process needed to be formalized in a way where it would incorporate kind of that very vulnerable, intimate essence in all of our communications. And so it being the first, I served as that mediator, and the anger and resentment definitely came through. But it also was a learning curve where I was able to realize that having some sort of structure around this conversation would allow for both parties to feel heard as well as valued.
Beautiful, beautiful. When you first went to the government person to sort of say we need to do a reset, what was their response?
They were quiet at first, because that's kind of just how they respond is typically in a very in the beginning it was a little bit sterile, but as the farmer was allowed to kind of have a second go at what they were saying, you can't really avoid human emotion, right? You can't avoid that the presence of identity in a room. There's always biases. There's always going to be relationships that are not just professional in a space where there's heightened emotion. And so the farmer was able to kind of redo or give another iteration of what they had to say. And that pretty much resolved everything, because then the government also responded in a familiar way as well. So they started to speak about their own farms, because these people in the agricultural ministry, they also had farms. It was in different places, and they have different, occupations. But it was easier to find common ground when we weren't just talking about legislation.
I'm glad you brought up emotional responding, because, as you said, we can't avoid it. And we know that when you try to avoid it, it's going to rear its ugly head, so to speak, that it needs to be acknowledged and addressed where possible, but it can interfere with our goals as a leader, because once emotions come into play, we're no longer objective in a situation. We're now coming from whether it's a wound or simply anger, resentment. That's going to color our perspective, what we're actually, how we interpret what's going on. So I'm glad you brought it up. Say a little bit more about how you experience emotion, the emotional aspect of what's going on, because clearly you're talking about something that, as you said, there's resentment, there's anger. How did you manage the emotional responses on both sides?
I think that this actually brings up another example from that research trip. There was a moment where we were conducting an interview with a farmer, and we only got through maybe the first two questions before she broke down in tears. And in her breaking down in tears, she wasn't expressing anger or resentment. She was expressing kind of defeat, in that talking about these topics surrounding kind of like farming and money made her think about what she did not have, and us being kind of perceived as connected to the government made her feel as though we could be helpful to her, where she could ask for our assistance in a very direct way. Because, in Jamaica, these mountains are very hard to navigate. And so typically this is not an area of Jamaica where there are a lot of tourists. This is not an area of Jamaica where a lot of Americans come. And so in that experience, the interview was stopped, kind of everything was kind of put to the side. And we were able to have a much more human conversation, where there was a discussion of what is actually useful. I think that in academia and science, oftentimes, even when we do kind of try to avoid being extractive, try to avoid being unuseful, we're giving things that aren't necessarily needed. And so that moment of emotion and crying allowed for us to kind of like better our offerings and better understand what is actually needed, as opposed to what we want or what we think they needed.
You refer frequently to the scientific approach, the scientific method, and the title of this podcast is Quantum Leadership, with implications based on the quantum effect, on some lessons from quantum physics. And the couple that really stand out to me, or one that stands out to me, is how the observer affects what's being observed, which is in such contradiction to the whole scientific notion of separation, objectivity. And we're learning more and more that may not at all be possible. And so here we're talking about you as the implementer of a program. And in fact, your part, once you enter into this environment, you're part of that environment. And recognizing the significance of you being a part of that environment in terms of relationship, in terms of impact, can't be denied. And it's important to recognize so that you can find ways to use it to your advantage.
Absolutely. I think that in using it to our advantage is a common kind of like thought that I'd like others to have. I have many opinions about kind of how, social science and the more kind of conventional ideas of the scientific method can be merged, have been merged, should continue to be merged. And especially in considering kind of like the dynamics of how politics enters the conversation. I don't view science as something that's apolitical. I don't view science as something that is absent of all biases. I think that we should embrace those things, and that they also diversify thought and diversify the ways in which that we can approach problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And so you're demonstrating doing this within the work that you're doing, which, to me is another aspect of leadership, which is I'm going to come up with my own perspective on this. I don't have to take this one's perspective or that one's. I can come to this experience, this project with my own originality to take the best of what I'm finding in the different approaches and synthesize that to an approach that would work even better.
Always, at all
Mm-hmm.
times. Yeah. I think that throughout my life and throughout my time, conducting research, being a scientist, creating projects, I found that I've always faced a lot of resistance when it comes to interdisciplinarity. I'm not always sure where it comes from, but I'm always sure that there is opportunity in response to that kind of resistance.
Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit more? Resistance is an important consideration.
Yeah.
Because we all come upon that resistance. And can you say a little bit more about your approach to dealing with resistance?
Yeah. So, for example, I started my PhD in an ecology and evolutionary biology department, very strictly, typical quantitative methods, very, run of the mill kind of department. And my proposal to do a more political ecology kind of social science project was the first time where I think that I was confronted with that resistance, where first, there's an element of, well, we don't know how this would work from the administration. And then there's also an element of, well, okay, you've presented a plan for how this will work. What if you fail? Or how do we know that this is, efficient and effective? And you don't. I guess that's the point. Is to be able to test these relationships and produce something that is unique to what's been done before. I guess the whole prospect of discovery in science to me is to keep moving forward. And I think that just because it's never been done before doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it. If anything, that just means there's something to be found.
Right. So here, your scientific approach is very supportive of your intention to move forward. But you're talking about a very common type of situation where what you're proposing is uncertain. If it's new, no one has the answer, the guarantee. And so for you, part of that process really is how do you convince the government, for example, to partner with the farmers? How do you get them to be open to this other perspective? How do you support them in stepping forward, moving forward into uncertain territory? I think that's a very key aspect of leadership.
It's critical. I think that when you said it back to me, I was thinking of it in a very specific way to my life. But I think that everybody experiences that at some point if you are our leader. Everyone wants to be kind of like, the best leader, the best at what they're doing. And so these forms of innovation make it unique in that way. Yeah, I have found that through those points of resistance, it makes me a lot more it has made me a lot more able to kind of view what people are motivated by. That's the first thing I look at when I'm entering a room is what is everyone's motivation? Why are you here? What are you doing? And why are you here? And how can I help you get a little bit closer to where you want to be? And even though there are 3 of you in this room with different things that you do, as well as different motivations, what are the touch points that would make it easier for me to do that labor to get all of you what you want, instead of having to do 3 times as much labor.
Right. So you used the resistance as a challenge. How do we, as opposed to shrinking from it, to embrace that challenge of dealing with the resistance? And, early we talked about how you engaged in relationship with the farmers and got their trust, and you stayed back instead of pushing to find their comfort zone and to find their timing and what works best for them. How did you do that with the government? How did you get their trust? Because ultimately, if you're going to get agreement and buy-in to move forward in an uncertain environment, that needs to happen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that it was easier to gain the government's trust, mainly because the modes of the academic environment are very similar to the modes of kind of a government environment, in that um, the credentials that I needed were pretty similar. A farmer knowing that I'm getting my PhD doesn't mean anything, but the government knowing that I'm getting my PhD does mean something. It means that I've gone through some sort of rigorous process of intellect and that they could trust me more. My track record working with different international governments, so going to the conference of parties and being able to be a delegate was something very appealing, in terms of being able to see the different connections and opportunities between different governments in a lot lesser capacities. But it just proves that I've been able to navigate the government space before, maybe not at the same scale, but with the same kind of pressures. And so it was a lot easier to actually gain the government's trust.
So you talked about easier gaining their trust, and part of what achieved that is kind of your body of work up to that point, and being in other locations and having successes in other locations. One of the processes that I think is so important in growing leadership, and my notion that you're not necessarily born a leader, you take the challenges in life that help you grow into a position of leadership. And one of the things that I find important, and I'd like your reflection on this, is you can have these achievements, but one of the keys to having it best support you is how you take in these achievements, how you own them, how you let them come in and literally become part of your foundation. Can you say about whether that was a conscious process on your part, or it just happened that you little by little owned your successes to add to your sense of confidence?
I think that was very deliberate on my part. A lot of the skills that I acquired from being a delegate at the Conference of Parties, a lot of the skills that I got from creating the Aya Research Institute, even, and, working with different academic groups in the nonprofit space, each of those skills were very specifically pulled into that situation. And I think that a lot of the things that I do are by design. It things that I'd accomplished a lot longer ago. So, for example, just like my speaking skills and communication, and being able to kind of create an argument. Those were something that came a lot more naturally. But understanding how governments work, understanding kind of like to speak to kind of like a middle person as opposed to the top executive somewhere, because they're going to have a lot more time. That was something I learned from being in a nonprofit space. Speaking to different party delegates in various different parts of the world allowed me to better understand what a Caribbean government might be, as opposed to kind of like a country in Europe. Yeah, I would say that the answer to your question is that was very deliberate, and those skills were honed up for a reason.
In this process, through your processes getting to where you are today, were there moments where you had some self-doubt, where you weren't sure, where it seemed a little too much for you, any of those things? And can you kind of go into that and how you dealt with that?
All the time. Having someone
all the time.
yeah, all the time.
Okay.
Having someone yell at you that your research project kind of just doesn't matter to them is not it's not for the faint of heart, especially speaking to people that you hold highly, different farmers. And so being able to transform kind of like that hurt or that sadness into something productive is very useful, I would say, as a leader, as well as important for the process.
Can you give a little bit more detail
Mhm.
about how you went from hurt to turning that around into something else?
Yeah. So I would say this is probably, I think I mentioned this one earlier in the pilot. There was a gentleman that I think was my second interview. They were very quiet as I was asking questions, giving minimal responses. And at the time, my Jamaican patois was not as great as it is now. And so they kind of just blew up, kind of just like, this is just some government, whatever. And like, you're here to just extract. And there's nothing you can do to help me, is the essence of what they were saying. I froze. I kind of recoiled and went back to my lab mate who's Jamaican, and she translated what I couldn't understand. And for maybe an hour of that day, I was just like, let's take an early lunch. And I cried about it. And I kind of was just like, I don't really know. I didn't know what to do with it at the time. And that's okay. But giving myself the time to process that and do what I was talking about before, use that as feedback as opposed to kind of just taking that in and allowing it to corrupt the entire mission of the project, was very important. There's no way to be a leader without getting any sort of kind of like feedback and not being able to have to manage like all these different kinds of emotions. And so I have experienced that in academic spaces as well. You and I both know that getting a PhD, you get a lot of critique, and the critiques are not always kind, but they are useful. And it's a fork in the road between, do you want to kind of use this to stall you, or do you want to use this as a transform it into a way to move forward?
Yeah, so you allowed for the hurt, for the tears, for the kind of getting deflated a bit, and you gave yourself a timeout. Put yourself into a position that allowed you to go into that space. I would say to sort of metabolize those feelings that we don't want to just push down. We want to move through them. And then that allowed you to come back and handle that situation again, recognizing that this is a part of the process. And I think the more we can recognize that anything that happens, we can interpret, frame as part of the process, rather than thinking we made a mistake, thinking that we did something wrong. That also facilitates that process.
Yes. And the only other piece I want to highlight from that is that I needed support. And so if my lab mate was not with me to, one, translate the pieces of Jamaican patois that I can understand, to me there then, and then also just to be there and kind of like provide some sort of solace and space for me to talk, I would have never been able to finish that project if I didn't have the support from them or other friends along the way.
Mm-hmm. In that moment where you went into the tears and you took the time out, was there a part of you that said, I don't know if this is going to work, or I don't know if I can handle it, or anything along those lines?
100%. There was a period during that session where I was kind of like, if everyone doesn't want to participate, what am I going to do? And that's what led to kind of the theory of change that I spoke about in the beginning, where I realized that I needed to allow for everyone to respond, come as you are.
Mm-hmm.
Come as you are. And I would want you to want to do it. If you participate, if you don't, that's fine. And if you have feedback, that's also great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I want to emphasize what you're saying right now, because some people think that being a leader means that you never get deflated. Being a leader means you never get hit and knocked down. But we're talking about what you do after you get knocked down, that you accept, you move through it, you consider it part of the process rather than I did something wrong. a very important part of that. And then you move back with new information from this feedback, from the experience, so that you could do it better the next time.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. We're doing great, and we have maybe another 5 or 10 minutes. I'd like to turn the spotlight inward into your organization. And can you share a little bit about how you demonstrate leadership within your organization, and what you could say about your organization that you feel particularly appreciative of?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Aya Research Institute has been near and dear to my heart in terms of being able to give a platform for a lot of environmental justice voices in the academic as well as political spaces. I serve as the executive director alongside my co-founder. And through that work, we've been able to have a lot of influence and integration with influence on domestic US policy, as well as integration and collaboration with different other environmental justice coalitions. And so we have done a lot of international work considering how to create a more connected landscape across the world for environmental justice. We have some different fellows in Europe as well as in the Caribbean who have been working with us to get a better lay of the land for the political environment of environmental justice. And through those projects, we've come to learn a lot about how we can better influence domestic US policy. And so the Aya Research Institute, our goal within the next 2 years is to use our fellowship program to promote these fellows into full-blown staff scientists for our think tank.
You use on your website the term just transition. Can you say what that's about, what that means?
Yes, that is a very important word. So the just transition was born from several labor unions in the 1970s, speaking to environmental injustices, but also speaking to the need for all the remedies for climate change, all the remedies for environmental injustices to include all people. So that means everyone needs to have a job in this world. Everyone needs to have equal access to renewables in this world. And so the just transition means kind of exactly what it says. Everyone needs to have a place, a job, a way forward, a good sense of their livelihood in a world where we are fully sustainable and where climate change is less of an issue.
That's a great vision and great goals. Last couple of questions, Alexa. I got a little nervous when I said Alexa because before we started our conversation, I said Alexa, and one of the listening devices in this room started talking to me.
Uh-huh. I am the first. I like to say that often. Mm-hmm.
Right. Right. Can you say a little bit about what you think your leadership style is within your organization with the people who work under or alongside of you?
Transformative. I really invest a lot of time into trying to show people that I'm leading that there are different parts of themselves that they may not have noticed or valued before. Oftentimes, I think people kind of neglect portions of their identity in order to conform to specific spaces that they think that they need to achieve in. And most often, I found that when I've done that, I have lost a great deal of opportunity for skill building and opportunity for me to kind of progress in a full way. I say that mainly thinking of kind of like my upbringing. So I am a descendant of the American South sharecropping community. So my grandparents, they were sharecroppers in Texas and in North Carolina. And throughout my childhood, we talked about agriculture all the time. We planted, we had lots of conversations about food and understanding kind of what that meant in an American context. And when I got into college, I kind of buried all of that. And now it is a very, very important part of why I like what I do, why I know so much about what I do. And I think that that's very common throughout a lot of individuals that I meet, to kind of bury parts of your identity in order to conform to what they think is a form of success. And so, yeah, I would say that my leadership style is transformative.
Beautiful, beautiful. And I want to step back to your Jamaica experience
Hmm.
and ask you how the lessons of that experience, how the way you dealt with that situation and the results that you got, how has that translated into other locations or other people following what you were doing there?
Yeah. So after I had that experience, there were several people at the University of Michigan that actually asked me to speak in their courses about how I navigated that, because University of Michigan, is a very well-known research institution, and it's often very hard to navigate that when you're kind of alone in the field. And so, through me speaking in different courses, and the different projects in different parts of the world. So, for example, I did another project in Hawaii, which may seem very kind of like domestic and American, but Hawaii is a very unique historical context when it comes to agriculture, and very diverse demographic. And navigating that space, I think, and connecting that to my experience in Jamaica was very important for people to understand, for me to understand that these skills are necessary everywhere, and
Yeah.
communicate that to other courses.
Beautiful, beautiful. I want to just highlight one of the things about your leadership style that you um, described to us is trying to raise all the people around you,
Hmm.
and which has an impact on those people and how effective they are, how confident they become, and how that grows their ability, capacity to serve the company even better.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't really think there's a point in stifling anyone's success in, trying to create an environment where they cannot grow, because in order to grow, you grow out of things. And so everything has a time limit.
Hmm. Yeah. And so finally, let me ask you, is there anything else about leadership that you want to share that we didn't touch on?
Not really. I think that the identity piece was the last thing that I really wanted to emphasize a moment ago. And I think that identity is very important for diversifying ideas and diversifying solutions that we're facing now. I think that a lot of the problems today, at least within the United States, can seem very daunting or impossible, but we've done many hard things in the history of humankind.
Hmm.
So.
Very good. Great. How can people find out more about what you're doing and reach you if they would like to?
Yeah, so I often update my Instagram as well as my personal website, alexawhite.co, not com.co. And then Instagram is Alexa B. White, at Alexa B. White, B as in boy.
Okay, great. Well, Alexa, thank you so much for joining me on this Quantum Leadership podcast. And everybody else, I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think bigger, lead with more authenticity, and take steps towards meaningful change. If you know a leader who would benefit from these insights, please share this episode with them. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and welcome to Leadership and Quantum Leadership. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining me on this Quantum Leadership podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think bigger, lead more authentically, and take steps toward meaningful change. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and make sure you subscribe and go to my website, drstephensideroff.com. Thank you again.